This is tape 1 of 3 tapes on the New Order of Barbarians, referred to on these tapes as simply the New World System. Tapes 1 and 2 are reminiscence by Dr. Lawrence Dunegan of a speech given on March 20th, 1969 by an insider of the Order, whose names and credentials are given in the interview with Dr. Dunegan on tape 3. The moderator for these tapes is Randy Engel, National Director, U.S. Coalition for Life.
There has been much written and much said by some people who have looked at all the changes that have occurred in American society in the past 20 years or so, and who have looked then retrospectively to earlier history of the United States and indeed of the world, and come to the conclusion that there is a conspiracy of sorts which influences, indeed controls, major historical events not only in the United States but around the world. This conspiratorial interpretation of history is based on people making observations from the outside, gathering evidence, and coming to the conclusion that from the outside they see a conspiracy. Their evidence and conclusion are based on evidence gathered in retrospect, period. I want to now describe what I heard from a speaker in 1969, which in several weeks will now be 20 years ago. The speaker did not speak in terms of retrospect, but rather predicting changes that would be brought about in the future. The speaker was not looking from the outside in, thinking that he saw conspiracy. Rather, he was on the inside, admitting that indeed there was an organized power, force, group of men who wielded enough influence to determine major events involving countries around the world, and he predicted, or rather expounded on changes that were planned for the remainder of this century. As you listen, if you can recall the situation, at least in the United States in 1969 and the few years thereafter, and then recall the kinds of changes which have occurred between then and now, almost 20 years later, I believe you'll be impressed with the degree to which the things that were planned to be brought about have already been accomplished. Some of the things that were discussed were not intended to be accomplished yet by 1988, but are intended to be accomplished before the end of this century. There is a timetable, and it was during this session that some of the elements of the timetable were brought out. Anyone who recalls early in the days of the Kennedy presidency, the Kennedy campaign, when he spoke of progress in the decade of the 60s, that was kind of a cliche in those days, the decade of the 60s. Well, by 1969, our speaker was talking about the decade of the 70s, the decade of the 80s, and the decade of the 90s. So that I think that terminology, that way of looking at things and expressing things, probably all comes from the same source. Prior to that time, I don't remember anybody saying the decade of the 40s and the decade of the 50s. So I think this overall plan and timetable had taken important shape with more predictability to those who control it sometime in the late 50s. That's speculation on my part. In any event, the speaker said that His purpose was to tell us about changes which would be brought about in the next 30 years or so that an entirely new worldwide system would be in operation before the turn of the century. As he put it, we plan to enter the 21st century with a running start. He said as we listened to what he was about to present, he said, "Some of you will think I'm talking about communism. Well, what I'm talking about is much bigger than communism." At that time, he indicated there is much more cooperation between East and West than most people realize. In his introductory remarks, he commented that he was free to speak at this time. He would not have been able to say what he was about to say even a few years earlier, but he was free to speak at this time because now, and I'm quoting here, "Everything is in place and nobody can stop us now." That's the end of that quotation. He went on to say that most people don't understand how governments operate, and even people in high positions in governments, including our own, don't really understand how and where decisions are made. He went on to say that the people who really influence decisions are names that, for the most part, would be familiar to most of us, but he would not use individuals' names or names of any specific organizations. But that if he did, most of the people would be names that were recognized by most of his audience. He went on to say that they were not primarily people in public office, but people of prominence who were primarily known in their private occupations or private positions. The speaker was a doctor of medicine, a former professor at a large Eastern university, and he was addressing a group of doctors of medicine, about 80 in number. His name would not be widely recognized by anybody likely to hear this, and so there's no point in giving his name. The only purpose in recording this is that it may give a perspective to those who hear it regarding the changes which have already been accomplished in the past 20 years or so, and a bit of a preview to what at least some people are planning for the remainder of this century, so that we or they would enter the 21st century with a flying start. Some of us may not enter that century. His purpose in telling our group about these changes that were to be brought about was to make it easier for us to adapt to these changes. Indeed, as he quite accurately said, they would be changes that would be very surprising and in some ways difficult for people to accept, and he hoped that we, as sort of his friends, would make the adaptation more easily if we knew somewhat beforehand what to expect. Somewhere in the introductory remarks, he insisted that nobody have a tape recorder and that nobody take notes, which for a professor was a very remarkable kind of thing to expect from an audience. Something in his remarks suggested that there could be negative repercussions against him if it became widely known what he was about to say to our group, if it became widely known that indeed he had spilled the beans, so to speak. When I first heard that, I thought maybe that was sort of an ego trip, somebody enhancing his own importance. But as the revelations unfolded, I began to understand why he might have had some concern about not having it widely known what was said, although this was a fairly public forum where he was speaking. The remarks were delivered, but nonetheless he asked that no notes be taken, no tape recorder be used, suggesting there might be some personal danger to himself if these revelations were widely publicized. Again, as the remarks began to unfold and some of the rather outrageous things that were said at that time, they certainly seemed outrageous, I made it a point to try to remember as much of what he said as I could, and during the subsequent weeks and months and years to connect my recollections to simple events around me, both to aid my memory for the future in case I wanted to do what I'm doing now, record this, and also to try to maintain a perspective on what would be developing if indeed it followed the predicted pattern, which it has. At this point, so that I don't forget to include it later, I'll just include some statements that were made from time to time throughout the presentation, just having a general bearing on the whole presentation. One of the statements was having to do with change. People get used, the statement was, people will have to get used to the idea of change. So used to change that they'll be expecting change. Nothing will be permanent. This often came out in the context of a society of where people seem to have no roots or moorings, but would be passively willing to accept change simply because that was all they had ever known. This was sort of in contrast to generations of people up until this time where certain things you expect to be and remain in place as reference points for your life. So change was to be brought about, change was to be anticipated and expected and accepted, no questions asked. Another comment that was made from time to time during the presentation was, people are too trusting. People don't ask the right questions. Sometimes being too trusting was equated with being too dumb. But sometimes when he would say that and say people don't ask the right questions, it was almost with a sense of regret, as if he were uneasy with what he was a part of and wished that people would challenge it and maybe not be so trusting. Another comment that was repeated from time to time, this particularly in relation to changing laws and customs and specific changes. He said everything has two purposes. One is the ostensible purpose, which will make it acceptable to people. And second is the real purpose, which would further the goals of establishing the new system and having it. Frequently he would say, there's no other way. There's just no other way. This seemed to come as sort of an apology, particularly when at the conclusion of describing some particularly offensive changes, for example, the promotion of drug addiction, which we'll get into shortly. He was very active with population control groups, the population control movement, and population control was really the entry point into specifics following the introduction. He said the population is growing too fast. Numbers of people living at any one time on the planet must be limited, or we will run out of space to live. We will outgrow our food supply, and we will overpollute the world with our waste. People won't be allowed to have babies just because they want to or because they are careless. Most families would be limited to 2. Some people would be allowed only 1, and the outstanding person or persons might be selected and allowed to have 3. But most people would allow to have only 2 babies. That's because the zero population growth is 2.1 children per completed family, so something like every 10th family might be allowed the privilege of the 3rd baby. To me, up to this point, the word population control primarily connoted limiting the number of babies to be born. But this remark about what people would be allowed and then what followed made it quite clear that when you hear population control, that means more than just controlling births. It means control of every endeavor of the entire world population. A much broader meaning to that term than I had ever attached to it before hearing this. As you listen and reflect back on some of the things you hear, you will begin to recognize how one aspect dovetails with other aspects in terms of controlling human endeavors. Well, from population control, a natural next step then was sex. He said sex must be separated from reproduction. Sex is too pleasurable and the urges are too strong to expect people to give it up. Chemicals in food and in the water supply to reduce the sex drive are not practical. The strategy then would be not to diminish sex activity, but to increase sex activity, but in such a way that people won't be having babies. And the first consideration then here was contraception. Contraception would be very strongly encouraged, and it would be connected so closely in people's minds with sex that they would automatically think contraception when they were thinking or preparing for sex. And contraceptives would be made universally available. Nobody wanting contraception would be find that they were unavailable. Contraceptives would be displayed much more prominently in drugstores and right up with the cigarettes and the chewing gum out in the open rather than hidden under the counter where people would have to ask for them and maybe be embarrassed. This kind of openness was a way of suggesting that contraceptives are just as much a part of life as any other item sold in the store. And contraceptives would be advertised. And contraceptives would be dispensed in the schools in association with sex education. The sex education was to get kids interested early, making the connection between sex and the need for contraception early in their lives, even before they became very active. At this point, I was recalling some of my teachers, particularly in high school, and found it totally unbelievable to think of them agreeing to, much less participating in distributing contraceptives to students. But that only reflected my lack of understanding of how these people operate. That was before the school-based clinic programs got started. Many cities in the United States by this time have already set up school-based clinics, which are primarily contraception, birth control, population control clinics. The idea then is that the connection between sex and contraception introduced and reinforced in school would carry over into marriage. Indeed, if young people, when they matured, decided to get married, marriage itself would be diminished in importance. He indicated some recognition that most people probably would want to be married, but that this certainly would not be any longer considered to be necessary for sexual activity. No surprise then that the next item was abortion, and this now back in 1969, 4 years before Roe v. Wade. He said abortion will no longer be a crime. Abortion would be accepted as normal and would be paid for by taxes for people who could not pay for their own abortions. Contraceptives would be made available by tax money so that nobody would have to do without contraceptives. If school sex programs would lead to more pregnancies in children, that was really seen as no problem. Parents who think they are opposed to abortion on moral or religious grounds will change their minds when it is their own child who is pregnant. So this will help overcome opposition to abortion. Before long, only a few diehards will still refuse to see abortion as acceptable, and they won't matter anymore.